The conference room was cold. Too cold. The kind of cold that made your skin prickle, your bones ache. The fluorescent lights above hummed relentlessly, adding to the tension that had been building for weeks. "You're not cutting it, Alex." The words hung in the air like a bitter fog, suffocating the space between her and her boss. Emma's heart skipped a beat, a desperate thud against her ribcage. She had been dreading this moment for days, weeks, even, but now that it had arrived, the weight of it crushed her chest. Her gaze flicked to her colleagues around the table. They were all silent, their eyes trained on the polished surface of the table or the ceiling, anywhere but her. No one met her eyes. She couldn't tell if it was sympathy or disgust that they were hiding. "Your numbers are down," her boss, Daniel, continued, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "The metrics are undeniable. You're the weak link here, and it's affecting the entire team. You've been given chance after chance, but your morale is dragging us all down. You've got two options. You can fix yourself, or you can step aside." She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She hated this. The way his words landed with the same force as a slap. The way he said, "Step aside," as though she were an inconvenience, something to be swept under the rug. He'd never said it before, but she could hear the implication clearly. She was no longer valuable to him. "Emma," Daniel continued, his voice now eerily calm, "go home. Take the time you need to get yourself together. You're not going to get any more chances here." She stood frozen, a wave of humiliation crashing over her, washing away every ounce of pride she had left. Was he done? Was she done? She didn't know if it was the sudden burning in her throat, or the tightness in her chest, but for a split second, her vision blurred. She could hear the faint buzz of her phone vibrating in her bag, but it felt miles away. She didn't want to look at her team, but she did anyway. There was a flicker of judgment in their eyes, not one of them daring to speak or even move. "This is it," she thought. "This is the moment I'm nothing to them anymore." But it wasn't just her team. It was the company. The whole damn world, it seemed. All she had worked for. All the sacrifices. It meant nothing now. "Get your things," Daniel said, pushing a folder of papers toward her. He didn't even look up from the screen in front of him. "And please don't come back until you've fixed whatever's wrong with you." She could feel every eye in the room on her now. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to throw the damn folder in his face and walk out. But instead, she clenched her jaw, fighting back the tears threatening to spill over. She'd never let them see her like this. She couldn't. Her hands shook as she gathered her things, the weight of the silence in the room making it unbearable. She grabbed her laptop, her notebook, the mug she'd used every morning for the past 2 years. Felt wrong to be leaving this way. Felt like she was abandoning everything she'd ever worked for. Her stomach twisted into a knot, and she felt a tightness creep into her throat. "Emma," Daniel called after her, his tone suddenly cold, detached. "Take this as a wake-up call. If you don't get it together, you won't just be walking out of here today. You'll be out of this industry for good." She froze at the door, her hand on the handle. The finality of his words pierced through her, sharp and unforgiving. It was as if the world had suddenly collapsed beneath her feet. She wanted to turn around, to argue, to tell him that she was capable, that she could still turn it around, but the words stuck in her throat. So, she did the only thing she could do. She opened the door. The door clicked shut behind her, a faint echo reverberating down the empty hallway. The sound seemed to stretch out, like a final punctuation mark on the worst day of her life. She took a step forward and then another. She wasn't sure where she was going. The cold air of the hallway bit at her skin, but it didn't feel like enough to wake her from the nightmare she just lived through. The walls seemed to close in around her, a blur of muted colors and harsh fluorescent lights. Her mind raced, but there were no answers, no clarity, only the crushing weight of what had just happened. She had been dismissed. For the first time in her life, she had been told she wasn't good enough. "Hey, Emma." She stopped short, a voice, one she hadn't expected. It was Jacob, the one person who hadn't turned his back on her. He stood at the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall, his arms folded across his chest. His face was a mix of sympathy and something else she couldn't quite read. "Don't," she whispered, barely able to choke the words out. "Just don't." But Jacob took a few steps forward anyway, his voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to leave like this. You." She cut him off, her voice cracking, barely a whisper. "You don't get it, Jacob. I'm done. It's over. I'm nothing here." They made it clear. Jacob hesitated, his expression flickering with concern. But then, after a long pause, he gave a quiet nod. "If you think this is the end, fine. But I'm telling you, Emma, it's just the beginning." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned and walked away. Step by step, each footfall felt heavier than the last. She walked out the door, through the lobby, and into the frigid afternoon air. The cold wind slapped her face, but it didn't numb the sting inside. As she walked down the street, she didn't know what was more overwhelming, the sting of failure or the crushing weight of what lay ahead. Everything she had worked for had crumbled, and she felt smaller than she ever had before. But as her breath fogged in the cold air, something inside her stirred. A whisper, barely a thought, began to form. This isn't the end. Can't be. She wasn't done yet. She would find a way back. But first, she had to find herself. The days after Emma left the office felt like a blur, the minutes crawling past her in agonizing slowness. Each morning, she woke to the same emptiness, the same weight pressing down on her chest. The apartment she had once been proud of now felt suffocating. Its walls, too close, its silence, deafening. She hadn't turned on her laptop since that day. She couldn't. Every time she even considered it, her stomach churned. The thought of going back to that life felt unbearable. But the bills kept arriving, the reminders of a life she no longer recognized. She couldn't escape it forever. The first week was the hardest. She spent it staring out the window, watching the world go on without her. People walked down the street, laughing, talking, rushing to meet deadlines. They had purpose. She had nothing. The rejection from her boss had seared her. She hadn't expected it to feel so deep, so personal. It wasn't just a professional setback. It felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed about herself. She'd been the reliable one, the steady one, the one who always found a way to make it work. So why had she failed now? On the fourth day, she received a text from her mother. "I'm worried about you. Call me when you can." Emma stared at it for a long time, her thumb hovering over the screen. She hadn't spoken to her mother since she had been sent home from work, avoiding her family's calls because she couldn't bear to hear their concern. What would she even say? She couldn't even explain what had happened to herself, let alone to them. But after a long pause, she finally typed back, "I'm okay, just need some time." Her mother's response came quickly, "I love you. Don't shut yourself off. Okay? I'm here when you're ready." That simple message, the warmth in it, cut through her like a knife. She had been pushing everyone away, thinking she could handle this alone. But she couldn't. Not anymore. That night, Emma went for a walk in the city. The air was cold, biting at her skin, but it felt good. It felt like she was doing something, anything, to fight against the pull of isolation. She passed by the small cafe where she and her colleagues used to meet after work, a place they would decompress and talk about the day. The memory of those afternoons hit her like a punch to the gut. What would they think of her now? Would they feel sorry for her? Disappointed? At the far end of the block, she noticed a small bookstore tucked between two high-rises, its neon sign flickering in the window. Without thinking, she walked toward it, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. She had always loved books, even before the job consumed her life. When was the last time she'd allowed herself to read for pleasure? The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The smell of paper and ink filled the air, a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. A few people were browsing, their faces hidden behind books, but it was quiet and peaceful in here. She wandered down the aisles, her fingers trailing over the spines. Each book felt like a promise. Stories that were written with purpose, stories that went somewhere, no matter how small. It made her realize how far she had drifted from her own story. She had been so focused on climbing the ladder, on proving her worth, that she had forgotten the joy of simply existing. Her eyes stopped on a book with a simple, faded cover, The Art of Starting Over. It seemed almost too fitting. She pulled it from the shelf, sat down in one of the worn armchairs near the back, and began to read. The pages spoke to her in a way she hadn't expected. The author talked about the value of failure, not as something to fear, but as a powerful tool for change. There was a chapter dedicated to the importance of self-compassion, of giving yourself the space to breathe and grow, even when everything seems to be falling apart. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt something inside her stir, hope. It wasn't a loud, triumphant kind of hope. It was quieter, more subtle, but it was there. Maybe she didn't have to stay stuck in this pit of failure forever. Maybe there was something she could do to rebuild. When she finished the book, she stayed in the chair for a long while, letting the words settle. It wasn't a perfect solution. She knew that. There were still days when she couldn't shake the feeling of defeat, when the weight of her past mistakes felt unbearable. But now there was a flicker of possibility. That night she couldn't sleep. Instead, she grabbed her journal from the shelf and began to write. What if I could go back and do something no one else would? The thought came out of nowhere, but once it was written down, it wouldn't leave her. She'd been dismissed, humiliated. But what if that was the very thing that could fuel her next move? She closed her eyes, imagining it. A daring plan. Something risky, something bold. What if she could do the thing her team was too afraid to attempt? The idea lingered in her mind as the hours passed, becoming clearer with each passing minute. The next morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of clarity. She could go back to the company, not to ask for forgiveness, not to beg for a second chance, but to show them that she could solve the problem they had given up on. She didn't know exactly how yet, but the gears were turning. As the day wore on, Emma spent hours researching, reading up on innovative approaches in her field, consulting mentors who had always believed in her. Slowly, the pieces of her plan began to fall into place. It was risky. It was untested. It was exactly the kind of move no one else would make. But she felt it in her gut. This was the way forward. This was the chance to prove to herself, to everyone else, that she could still do this. That she could turn things around, even when it felt impossible. The days stretched into weeks, but she wasn't idle anymore. She began to reach out to former colleagues, those who had supported her in the past, asking them for help. She pieced together resources, aligned the logistics, and crafted a plan that seemed almost absurd in its audacity. But it felt right. She wasn't going to just survive this failure. She was going to rise from it, and this plan, this daring, impossible plan, was her way out. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing ever was. But Emma had made a promise to herself. She wouldn't go down without a fight. By the time Emma was ready to present her plan, the doubts started to creep in. They had been there from the beginning, whispering in the corners of her mind. Voices telling her she wasn't capable, that she'd made a mistake, that she was setting herself up for another crushing defeat. But she'd learned, over the past few weeks, how to drown them out. Every time the fear rose, she reminded herself why she was doing this. She had been sent home for a reason. Her morale was low. Her energy had been depleted. But she had found something more than just a plan, something she hadn't realized she had inside her. Now all that remained was to execute it. And to do that, she would have to face the very people who had dismissed her. The day she walked back into the office, it was as if nothing had changed. The sterile smell of the place, the hum of the air conditioning, the flickering lights in the hallway, they all seemed eerily familiar. It was like stepping back into a world that had turned its back on her. Yet here she was, walking straight into the heart of it. She had expected the tension, but it still felt like a punch in the gut when she stepped into the conference room. It was like everyone had been waiting for her to fail again, watching her closely, waiting to see how long her renewed confidence would last. Daniel, her boss, was the first to look up. His eyes narrowed when he saw her, but he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The rest of the room followed suit. Colleagues, managers, and stakeholders. Their faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and doubt. Emma could feel it, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. They were all wondering the same thing. Could she really do this? Emma, Daniel said, his voice cold but polite. I wasn't expecting to see you today. I thought you were still regrouping. His words stung, but she didn't flinch. She walked to the front of the room and set her laptop down on the table with a firm motion, as if to say, I'm not here to ask for permission. I'm not here to regroup, Emma said, her voice steady, louder than she had expected. She met Daniel's gaze without hesitation. I'm here to show you that I can fix this. There was a long pause, thick with uncertainty, as if no one quite knew how to react to her boldness. Emma cleared her throat, then clicked the button to bring up the first slide of her presentation. It was clean and simple, no frills, just the facts. The data she had gathered from weeks of research sat at the center of her plan. It was brilliant, it was risky, and it was exactly the kind of move no one in the company would dare make. She'd spent hours poring over figures, speaking to former colleagues, and analyzing what went wrong. The solution she was proposing wasn't conventional. It was radical. It would take the company's strategy in an entirely new direction, but she believed it could work. She felt the eyes on her, their skeptical stares pushing against her, but she stood tall, forcing herself not to shrink beneath the pressure. You all know the problem, she started, her voice calm but insistent. Our team's performance has dropped. We've missed our targets for 3 quarters in a row. There's no denying that. But what I'm proposing isn't another round of tweaks. It's not about trying harder or working longer hours. It's about taking a completely new approach. One that no one else is willing to try. Emma clicked the mouse again, and the next slide appeared. A bold proposal. We're going to focus on innovation over traditional metrics. We're going to take the data we have and turn it on its head. Instead of following industry trends, we'll create our own. It's high risk, but it's the only way we'll stand out in the market. It's time to stop playing it safe. She paused, letting her words settle in the air. She could see the skepticism in their eyes, hear the whispers that began to stir around the table. Emma, this sounds like a huge gamble, Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. He had always been one of her allies, but even now his doubt was clear. We've tried bold moves before, and they haven't worked. What makes you think this will be different? She met his eyes, her heart pounding, but her voice was steady. Because I'm not asking you to just take my word for it. I've done the math. I've calculated the risks. I know this is a huge gamble, but it's one we have to take if we want to survive. Survive? Daniel scoffed, leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed. This sounds like a desperate move, Emma, a last-ditch effort. And I'm sorry, but I can't put the future of this company in your hands after everything we've already been through. His dismissal cut deeper than she expected. The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket of cold water. He was right about one thing, this was a gamble. But she wasn't backing down. This isn't a desperate move, she said, her voice gaining strength. This is a calculated risk. You can either keep playing it safe and watch us fade into obscurity, or you can trust me and give this a shot. The room was silent for a moment, the tension hanging thick in the air. Emma felt her palms sweat as she waited for the reaction. Jacob shifted in his seat, his eyes never leaving hers. And what if it doesn't work? What's the plan then? Her throat tightened, but she swallowed hard, looking him dead in the eye. Then I'll be the first one to admit I was wrong. But I'll give it everything I have to make sure that doesn't happen. She turned back to Daniel, who had yet to speak. I'm not asking for your trust, Emma said, her voice low but steady. I'm asking for a chance. The silence in the room was deafening. Emma had laid it all out. She had taken the leap. Now it was up to them. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze sharp, calculating. The others in the room waited, some with their arms crossed, others nervously shifting in their seats. The energy was palpable, but Emma didn't break. She stood her ground, knowing she had already given everything she could. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel spoke. You'll have your chance, Emma. But understand this. If this doesn't work, you'll be on your own. Her heart raced, but she nodded. She had expected no less. She wasn't afraid of the challenge anymore. "I'll prove it works," she said quietly, before turning and walking out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence behind her. She had fought for the chance. Now, the hardest part was just beginning. The first week after Emma's bold proposal felt like a fever dream. Every day, she woke up to the cold, hard reality that she was the only one who truly believed in her plan. She was swimming upstream, fighting a current of doubt and skepticism from every side. The tension from the meeting still lingered in the air, a cloud that followed her everywhere she went. The company had agreed to give her a chance, but there was no applause, no congratulations. They were watching her, waiting for her to fail, and she could feel their eyes on her back with every move she made. The risk she had proposed was huge, but the stakes were higher than anyone realized. If it didn't work, it would be her, and her alone, who would fall. At first, the work seemed easy enough. She had the data, the proposal, the calculations. It was all there. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized how fragile the plan truly was. There were things she hadn't accounted for, variables she couldn't have predicted. For one, the team wasn't fully on board. Oh, they had agreed in principle, but when it came to execution, they were hesitant. People questioned the timelines. They doubted the resources. They asked questions that Emma didn't have the answers to. The cracks began to show. It was a Friday afternoon when the first major setback occurred. Emma had spent days analyzing customer data, crafting a new approach to their product design based on the bold new metrics she had proposed. The first iteration of the product was supposed to be ready for testing, but when they ran the initial tests, nothing worked. The design had major flaws, features didn't function as promised, and the metrics didn't align with what they had anticipated. Emma stood in the middle of the lab, watching the results unfold in front of her on the screen. She could feel the sweat beating on her forehead as the room grew colder with the silence of failure. Her heart raced as she tried to process what had gone wrong. How could I have missed this? She asked herself, panic starting to settle in her gut. Why didn't I see this coming? As the engineers started talking over one another, each one pointing out where things had gone wrong, Emma could barely hear them over the deafening pulse of her own anxiety. "We need to pivot," one of the engineers said, voice tinged with frustration. "This isn't going to work. We're wasting resources. We're way off track." Emma's hands were shaking. She wanted to argue, to tell them they just needed to tweak the plan, adjust it a little, but the words wouldn't come. All she could think was, this was supposed to be the breakthrough. It was supposed to work. It was Jacob who pulled her aside later that day, his face hard but not unkind. "You're pushing too hard," he said, a concerned edge to his voice. "You need to step back and regroup. Look at what you're asking of the team. They're not buying into this. They're scared it won't work." "I can't step back," Emma replied, her voice nearly a whisper. "Not now. This is the only chance we have." Jacob shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "You're asking for faith, Emma, but you haven't given them a reason to believe in you yet." Emma walked away from him, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a heavy stone. "I haven't given them a reason?" She could feel the walls closing in on her. The plan had been so perfect in her mind, but reality was unraveling it. The team was falling apart, the company was doubting her, and all she had left was hope, and that was starting to feel like a flimsy thing to cling to. As the week went on, Emma spent every moment trying to fix the mistakes. She worked late into the nights, rewriting code, making adjustments, and attempting to rebuild the trust that had eroded so quickly. Each attempt seemed to hit a new roadblock. The team was frustrated. The tests were failing. Every new iteration felt like it was one step closer to a public breakdown. And then came the blow she hadn't seen coming, a company-wide meeting. Emma had been invited to present the progress on her project. She walked into the conference room, feeling the eyes of her colleagues boring into her back. The leadership team was there, their faces unreadable. Daniel sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, his eyes focused on her with a level of intensity that made her stomach churn. The meeting started, and Emma began her presentation. She showed the metrics, walked through the changes, explained what they had accomplished and what still needed work. Her voice was steady, but the crackle of tension was unmistakable. She could feel the doubt radiating from every corner of the room, and she was powerless to stop it. Halfway through, Daniel raised his hand. "Emma," he said, his voice measured. "You've had almost a month to make progress. The team's morale is low, and our investors are starting to question our direction. You said this was the solution, but I'm not seeing it." Her heart slammed in her chest. She had been prepared for hard questions, but not like this. Not in front of everyone, with all their eyes on her. Why didn't I fix it? Her mind screamed. Why didn't I catch this sooner? "Give me more time," she said, almost pleading. "We're close. We just need more testing. More refinement." There was a pause. A long, painful silence. The weight of his gaze felt like a stone pressing against her chest. "You're asking for time we don't have," Daniel said quietly. "The company is not going to wait forever, Emma. We need results. Now." His words were the final blow. The air seemed to leave the room in an instant. She had no backup, no safety net, no one to protect her anymore. "I'll fix it," Emma said, her voice barely audible. She couldn't bear to hear herself sound so small, so desperate. But the alternative, admitting failure, was unthinkable. She could see the others shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. They were already preparing for the next chapter without her. Emma's stomach twisted into a knot as she realized how close she had come to the edge of being written off. But this was her moment. The moment when everything could fall apart or everything could fall into place. And no matter what, she would find a way to make it work. Later that night, Emma sat alone in her apartment, staring at the screen. The numbers, the data, the calculations all blurred in front of her. She could feel the panic creeping back up, threatening to swallow her whole. But somewhere, buried deep beneath the anxiety and frustration, there was a flicker of clarity. She wasn't done yet. She couldn't be. She grabbed her notebook and started writing down every idea she had, every possible solution, no matter how crazy it seemed. She didn't have time for self-doubt anymore. She was running out of time. But that didn't matter. She had already come this far. The struggle wasn't over. But neither was she. The final days leading up to the execution of Emma's plan felt like an endless climb. She barely slept, poring over data, testing, revising, and reworking every detail of her proposal. The plan was different now, refined, stronger, more resilient than it had been before. But it still carried a heavy weight, one that threatened to crush her at any moment. This was it, the final shot. If this failed, there would be no coming back. The company would pull the plug. Her reputation would be tarnished beyond repair. The team had come around, but barely. Jacob had helped, though his earlier doubts still lingered in the air like an unspoken tension. Some of the engineers had begun to see the merit in the changes Emma had proposed, but the momentum had been hard to build. Every step forward seemed to require 10 more steps of convincing and cajoling. She'd had to prove that she wasn't just a woman with a good idea. She was someone capable of pulling this off under the most impossible circumstances. Her internal world had shifted too. The weight of fear no longer gripped her the way it once had. It was as if, through all the failures and setbacks, she had found a new strength buried deep inside her. She wasn't just fighting for her job anymore. She wasn't just fighting to prove that she was right. Now, she was fighting to prove that she could take the boldest of risks and still find a way to make it work. And so, when the final moment arrived, the day the new product design and strategy were due for final testing, Emma was calm. On the outside, she appeared composed, but inside, her heart was racing. Her breath was shallow, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was determined. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to back down. The testing day was set. It was a cold morning when the team gathered in the testing room, this time with the full attention of the leadership team. Daniel stood at the front, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Emma could feel the weight of his gaze even as she gathered the team together. "You all know what's at stake here," she began, her voice steady, clear. "If this works, we turn everything around. If it doesn't, we may lose everything. But I'm confident in what we've done. We're ready." The engineers and developers murmured their agreement, some more convincingly than others. Jacob gave her an encouraging nod. Emma smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She could feel the tension in the room, the palpable uncertainty hanging in the air like a storm cloud. She wasn't alone, but she felt alone, as though she was the only one walking this tightrope. The first test began. Emma watched as the new design was put through its paces. The team tracked every result on their screens, observing how the new product reacted to the stress tests, the simulations, the metrics. With each passing minute, Emma's breath grew more shallow. The seconds felt like hours. Then it happened. The first success. One of the key features of the new design worked beyond their expectations. The numbers, the performance indicators, and the response times, they all aligned. The room collectively let out a sigh, and Emma felt a small, quiet victory seep through her. It wasn't a guarantee yet, but it was a start. "That's what we've been waiting for," Jacob said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Emma allowed herself a single breath of relief, but she didn't let her guard down. There was still more to test, more hurdles to cross. The next series of tests pushed the design to its limits. The team was on edge, fingers hovering over keyboards, eyes glued to the screens. Emma held her breath, watching the results. And then, another success. Boom, boom, boom. The sound of each test passing like a drumbeat. They were doing it. The impossible was slowly becoming possible. As the final tests were run, Emma allowed herself a quiet smile. The results were undeniable. The changes she had made, her daring, risky approach, had worked. The product was performing at levels that no one had expected. It wasn't perfect, no product ever was, but it was functional, it was efficient, and it was ready for market. But there was still one final moment. One last test of not just the product, but of Emma herself. With trembling hands, she stepped up to the front of the room. Daniel had been quiet during the tests, his expression unreadable. Now, his eyes locked onto hers, and she felt the weight of the entire room on her shoulders. Everyone was waiting for him to speak. "Emma," Daniel said, his voice calm, yet there was a hardness in it that made her stomach tighten. "You've put a lot of work into this, and I'm sure you believe in it. But the final decision rests with the board." Emma nodded. She had known this moment would come. The pressure to deliver had never been higher, but she didn't back down. She had earned this chance. "I understand," she said, her voice firm, "but I've done the work. I've proven that it can be done. I'm asking for the opportunity to see it through. I'll make sure the final product is ready for launch on time. I won't let this fail." For a long moment, there was only silence. Daniel exchanged a glance with the other leadership members in the room, the tension palpable. Emma held her breath. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she had given everything she had. Her conviction, her heart, her entire future. She had put it all on the line. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You've proven something today, Emma. Against all odds. We'll take it to the board. But you have our word. If you can keep this momentum up, we're behind you." The words hung in the air. If you can keep this momentum up. That was the final hurdle. But it was all she needed to hear. She had earned the right to keep fighting, to push this project to its final stage. The team erupted into quiet applause, a reluctant but genuine acknowledgement of her achievement. Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. This wasn't the time for tears. This was her moment of triumph. She had done it, not just for herself but for the people who had doubted her. She wasn't a failure anymore. She was the one who had turned the tide. That evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emma allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had faced every challenge, every obstacle, and she had come out the other side not just alive, but stronger. The journey had been grueling. The pain, the doubt, the setbacks. Every moment of fear had been worth it. She had proven to herself that she was more than the sum of her failures. She had been given a second chance, and she had used it to rewrite her story. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight she could rest. She had earned it. And no matter what came next, Emma knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the person who had walked out of that office months ago. She was the person who had returned with a daring plan and made it work.